Hello and welcome to AgriFocus, brought to you by Agriland. I'm Stella Meehan and I'm joined today by Carol Lynch, tax partner and head of Customs and International Trade Services with BDO Ireland. Now, Ireland exports 90% of its agri-food produce, and therefore trade relations with other countries are extremely important to us. One of the most important trade relationships we have is with the United States. However, with the commencement of a new administration in the US under President Donald Trump, the longevity of that relationship is somewhat uncertain at the moment. President Trump has already imposed 25% tariffs on the likes of Canada and Mexico, and his focus next seems to be on the trade arrangements with the European Union. He has already threatened to impose tariffs of 200% on alcohol from the EU, a measure that has tillage farmers and maltsters here very concerned. Now, Carol Lynch from BDO Ireland, thank you for joining us. First of all, I suppose the main thing that we should ask is, for those who aren't in the business trade day in, day out, what is a tariff?
Hi, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. Essentially what a tariff is a tax on importing into a country. So when you import a product into the US, at the point of import, at the point of arrival essentially in the US, you have a customs tariff applied, same as any other country. So similarly, if you're importing into Europe, once you hit the European border in Ireland, for example, say Dublin, you will lodge a customs declaration with the revenue commissioners and you pay your import customs duties. Same in China, same in Australia. So every product which crosses the border of a territory has a customs duty rate applied to it.
And I suppose then, just in an overall general sense, what is the point of having these tariffs?
Well, I suppose they originated way back when, so to speak, as a protectionist measure. So ultimately, you wanted, should I say, to ensure that you were buying goods locally, keeping local people employed, bringing tax into the exchequer. That extended, say, in Europe into the European Union, and then the requirement that in order to access the EU from outside the EU, you were going to pay a tariff which would support EU producers to manufacture here, but also it's a budgetary measure. So the tax that's generated from the customs tariffs coming into the EU goes to the European Commission and not to Ireland, for example. And similarly, it would have been the same in the US and other territories. And if we look back to the 1930s in particular, tariffs were used as a means of protectionism to ensure that basically the countries would encourage their own producers and consumers would buy from those producers.
Okay, I understand now what the idea behind the tariffs is. So let's talk about exports then from Ireland. As I mentioned earlier, Carol, we export 90% of our agri-food produce. So how important are those exports, for example, for a country like Ireland?
Well, for Ireland in particular, we're a very open economy and we've kind of built our economy based on open trade, international trade, free trade, access to the EU on the one hand, encouraging inward investment on the other. So if you look at the country's too small to sustain a market here on its own. So we've gone down the road of actually being an international trade market where we've a very open economy, as I said, significantly encourage exporters. And if you look at our CSO stats from last year, you'll see that our exports have continued to grow on a year-on-year basis. And they, I think there were like 223 billion exports in 2024, which is massive for a country like Ireland. And 72 billion of those went to the US.
Wow. So what would be the impact then? We'll say some of these tariffs that President Trump is currently threatening or mooting. What sort of impact would that have on exports, particularly agri-food exports from Ireland?
It's going to have a serious impact on all sectors, and in particular agri. I think if we look at the kind of the top exports from Ireland, we know pharmaceuticals are a big area, and that's been covered quite a lot. IT exports, that's all really the multinational area. Then food and drink exports to the US, I think last year were in the region of about 2 billion. And if you look at Board Bia's 24-25 report, there's been a growth in exports to the US from Ireland. those exports tend to be Irish companies, more so than the multinationals, if we put it that way. So the impact of 25% on those goods, which is what President Trump is threatening, is going to seriously erode the profit margin or increase the price on the US market, neither of which is a good thing.
Absolutely. So what should companies do? Well, I'll come to that in a moment, I suppose. First, what would the EU do is probably more of a pertinent question, because obviously when President Trump started mooting that he wasn't happy with the trade relationship he has with the EU, or the US rather has with the EU, and then started mooting that he might be bringing in certain tariffs, and then of course the EU started reciprocating that sort of rhetoric, and they were saying they bring in retaliatory tariffs. So then it started becoming a bit of tit for tat with economies, caught in the trenches here. Like it's not just a thing of like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, or vice versa. But at the same time, if the EU brings in retaliatory tariffs, it's not just that hits American, because I have heard, for example, when he mooted the 200% tariff on alcoholic drinks, and tillage and maltsters and drinks companies in Ireland were concerned. But they were also concerned about the EU putting that tariff on American alcohol, in bourbon in particular, because a lot of Irish drinks company here use mixes of bourbon, or they use the crates that come over the bourbon, or wine crates, whatever they may be. And they found that wasn't useful either, the EU putting tariffs on the imports from the US.
Exactly. You get hit both ways. The world as it stands has global supply chains where goods move around for manufacturing. Very few things just get manufactured in one place and get exported and sold as those finished items. You're moving goods around all the time. So you impose customs duties in between on those supply chains. Everybody essentially gets hurt. So what's going to happen in this situation is President Trump is saying on 2nd of April he will announce the tariffs that are going to be applied to Europe. Europe has said that it is going to counter tariff, and it was going to impose those tariffs from 1st of April. It's pulled that back now to mid-April. So there's a list of products that the EU is looking at applying counter tariffs to. Some were set back in 2018 when there was an original dispute on aluminium and steel. Some are new. And the new list is very extensive. It covers pretty much almost everything that I can see. And really important, this is a really critical point for Irish companies. On that new EU list, that's open to discussion and debate right now. So the EU have opened a consultation process. You could go online and put in your views. If you have products that you don't want included, and explain your reason. Probably more effectively if you contact your local business representation body and actually work as a group to make sure your voice is heard. So I saw this morning, for example, one of the papers was announcing that L'Oreal and a group of cosmetic companies have approached the EU and as a group and said not to apply customs duties on imports of cosmetics because it wouldn't be good for the whole business, so to speak. So certainly with this, and if you're in the food and agri area, your farmers or your manufacturers of food products or beverages, really important to get together as a group and use all your trade bodies to approach the EU on that basis.
Yeah, because that was my next question, is essentially there are companies out there now, whether it's large agribusiness, whether it's tillage suppliers feeding into the drinks and the distillery industry, and they're quite concerned. It's end of March coming up, not yet the 2nd of April, so we're still somewhat in a vacuum of information as to what's actually going to happen. But is that your best advice, to start lobbying now, and preferably probably more in a group collective, because you've probably more strength?
Absolutely.
Imagine.
I mean, you can put your views in online, but one company putting their views in online is going to be with how many European companies? But if you're with a group of companies as part of an industry, then you're really having your voice heard. So that's critical right now. The time for doing that is literally this week. So I wouldn't be wasting any time.
But I suppose those companies as well, they may not understand fully the impact of this. They might need information from the likes of yourselves, Cara, because I suppose to go and make a point to the EU, they have to have their information and understand what that impact is. So they might need a bit of information first.
Yeah, so we in BDO provide monthly webcasts and monthly seminars, just an update to our clients on what's going on. It's available to anyone, even if you're not a client. That is taking place tomorrow on the night. I don't remember what day tomorrow is, but it's taking place tomorrow about 12 o'clock, and that'll be a monthly update. We also send out at this point weekly updates in terms of what's happening this week, where has it moved, who's doing what's the timing, where do you need. So last week, for example, I sent out an update saying here's the link to the place to the EU site where you'll make your views known if you want to do it individually, but I recommend doing it through your trade body. Here's the list of products that are on the agenda. So keep an eye on our website, or actually connect with me on LinkedIn. I always update on LinkedIn what we're doing when the webinars are taking place. And that's really for the purposes of making sure that Irish companies are informed and know what to do, because you can easily miss the dates at this moment in time.
Absolutely. And it's not just a case of if tariffs are put on Irish exports. Also, if there are tariffs on imports, we import, as you said rightly at the offset. You know, the supply chain around the world moves. We also have to import into this country. There are things we need, and there are businesses in the agri sector in this company that also have to import items for their supply chain, which will mean they'll also be impacted.
Exactly. And in some cases, there are products that you simply can't get anywhere else. So if you can only purchase from the US and now you're subject to a 25% import charge on that product, which you simply can't get anywhere else, that's going to have a huge impact on your cost of doing business. And those are the type of things you really need to bring out to the European Commission, because they also have a thing called a suspension procedure, whereby, say, in the normal trade world, if you are looking to import something and it can't be purchased in Europe, they will give you a 0% rate. So they're open to that kind of argument.
And we have talked a little bit there about the drinks in particular, because it's the most shocking one when you hear 200%. Nobody wants to hear that, I suppose, and it affects the tillage sector and the drink sector here. But another big sector that we export products from is the dairy sector. You know, people say, oh, pharma is big in Ireland. Dairy is big in Ireland. We're a global brand. The likes of Kerrygold's a global brand. You know, Glanbia has diversified out to their protein products and Optimum Nutrition, global brands now. And I mean, how could the tariffs potentially impact this sector? And this is a big sector for Ireland.
It's exactly the same way. So let's say you're importing or exporting, shall we say, dairy products into the US, and now you're getting hit with an additional 25% on the cost. How do you deal with that? So you need to look at things like who are you selling to? Who's acting as the importer? Who's going to absorb those costs? Are you passing them on to the consumer? Do you have competitors, in which case you might not be able to if you want to remain competitive in the US market? Or are you a standalone product which can't be sourced anywhere else, in which case you may be able to pass on the cost? You need to really check, you know, your basics, the value of the goods, the transfer price, the customs. I'm not going to go into the detail of all that, but there's certainly a lot of planning that needs to be done. Once, kind of this week, I would say move products as much as possible, get your products into the US, contact the European Commission, contact your local trade bodies, contact Enterprise Ireland, the Leos, everybody, literally talk to everybody. But also you're going to have to start planning ahead and say, okay, if this rate comes in, now at this point, what do I do to mitigate that? And that's going to be either looking at these planning procedures, in terms of customs and transfer pricing and customs valuation and origin. But also another one which is looking, and this takes a little bit of time, I know, having worked in this area for a lot of time, you need to diversify your exports. So particularly Canada, for example. We've seen the news reports. Canada and the US are definitely at loggerheads at the moment. A lot of US products being removed from the shelves in Canada. There's opportunities there for Irish exporters to replace those with Irish goods. And the EU and Canada have a free trade agreement, which means that if your goods qualify as originating in Europe, you can access the Canadian market at 0% customs duty. I think about 92% of products are covered. So there's a lot of opportunity in looking at those displaced markets. It does take time to build up, I know, a sales profile in a new country. But if you're there already, maybe increase your sales. Or just look for alternatives. So while you're managing your US situation, look to increase your exports to Canada, Europe, other countries. The EU has a trade agreement. We've been through this with Brexit, and it's a very similar kind of pattern.
Yeah. And Carol, overall, the EU tariffs may come in, the US tariffs may come in. But we're hearing a lot now that while President Trump came out at the beginning, you know, with these sort of shocking statements that this might happen, that ultimately he's not thinking so long term, because often that will damage the American economy more. Similarly, would EU tariffs in a retaliatory fashion, would they damage the EU economy as well at some point? In the more long term, would these tariffs be damaging?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nobody wants this. In the long term, and I suppose every economist has a different viewpoint, and I'm not an economist. But certainly, as for companies, for just individual businesses, tariffs cost you money. They impact your profit line. They increase cost for the consumer. So at a business day-to-day operational level, these will hurt. And if we look back to the first trade war in President Trump's first term, we had 2 years between, I think it was 2018 and 2020, where there was retaliatory tariffs by the EU on US products coming in, and they hurt businesses. So there's long-term economic viewpoints on what may or may not happen, but for, say, business advisors like myself, we're looking at the day-to-day. How does this impact a company staying in business today?
And would you say, in your opinion, that there is a prolonged period of this type of international, I don't like using the word trade war, but I mean, both sides are shouldering up here a bit, Do you see this as being a prolonged sort of period? I mean, it's a 4-year administration that President Trump will have in the US. And do you think it will continue for those 4 years? Or do you think it's more bluster coming in, with his usual sort of shock tactics initially, and just to kind of throw his weight around a little bit to start, but that it will maybe temper down a little as maybe the next 12 months go by? Or do you think, are we in for a bit of tit for tat for the next few years?
Again, I look back to the first kind of round of this back in 2018, and we had 2 years then. It's hard to tell with President Trump. He definitely goes for the shock factor and then negotiates. The EU is going to be looking to negotiate over the next 2 weeks. Ideally, that will work. It depends on what he feels he can achieve at any given time. There is, behind it all, an America First policy where the administration is very clear that they want to bring jobs back to America. They want to bring tax back to America. So there is a philosophy behind this. And it's then, okay, in that case, how bad is this going to get? I don't see it being an easy 4 years ahead, to put it that way. I think it's just a matter of how difficult is it going to be? Where can we negotiate? How can the US encourage manufacturing back to the US where it's applicable? It's not always going to be appropriate. How can they increase their tax base? And if they're not achieving that, will they continue with the heavy tariffs on non-US products? So it's turbulent at the moment. It's very hard to see your way through.
And also, the UK obviously being out of the EU bloc at the moment, is that saving it from this risk of being targeted with EU tariffs then?
Yeah, well, certainly the UK, so it's not EU, so it doesn't get hit as a EU exporter. So there is a saving. It's the balance of trade with the UK is not high enough to have caught the US attention. So it seems to be in a better position right now. For Ireland, we're part of a European bloc. It wouldn't matter what the Irish position was in many ways, because how tariffs are applied on Europe means that they're automatically applied on Ireland, and vice versa. And the UK is not part of that bloc, so it doesn't get hit with that tariff. And there hasn't been a suggestion as yet to apply tariffs onto UK products.
And Carol, you sort of answered the question there. Not that I thought there would be a possibility, maybe in one sense, but the president met with our Taoiseach on the St. Patrick's Day week and the trip abroad to Washington, and seemed very positive towards Ireland. There's a huge Irish base in America, obviously, and didn't seem to, in his narrative or in his rhetoric anyway, want to, in inverted commas, hurt Ireland in any way. There'd hardly be any situation that would arise where tariffs were imported in the EU, but that he would make a special exemption or anything like that. I'm guessing not. We're part of the bloc.
Yeah, as part of the bloc, it's Europe as one country. So you import into Europe, you export out of Europe. It's not individual member states. Now, what could happen is, as opposed to a universal tariff of 25%, that specific goods are chosen to have tariffs on them, and those goods would not be necessarily Irish goods. That would be one way of kind of minimising the impact on Ireland. Well, whether that will happen, it hasn't been suggested, and the goods that are being targeted if we look at whiskey, it's an Irish export. So possibly he could, minimise the impact by saying it's a specific tariff on specific products, but there hasn't been an indication of that.
Okay. And finally, if you had an agribusiness coming to you, whatever agribusiness it might be Ornua, might be Glanbia, might be any of them, is there anything that they can do over the next week apart from lobbying or something? Like logistically, is there any, like, should they be getting any amount of product they can get into the US and any amount of product that they need in Ireland quickly into Ireland?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like there, this is 2nd of April is kind of like the D-Day.
Yeah.
Get everything you can out to the States before that. Get everything in, and you can see from the statistics, the CSO stats in January, that's happening. There's been a huge increase in imports from the US, exports to the US. I'm assuming that's stockpiling.
Yeah.
So I certainly would recommend absolutely to do that.
Finally, if companies, maybe the smaller ones, as you said, it doesn't even have to be the smaller ones. The bigger ones can't take, tariffs either. They're going to be a hit to their business. If they are really concerned now and they're stockpiling or they're getting exports out, is there anything more they can do? Are they just going to have to, would your advice, say a business came into to yourselves now, would your advice just be that you might just have to reformulate your budgeting here? You might have to talk to your banks, your lenders, your financial side and just do some rearranging?
Well, yeah. So what I would do is look at your supply chain, analyse what would a 10% hit, what would a 20%, what would a 25% hit mean? Where do you get your raw materials from? Can you source them, if they're coming from the US, can you source them from Europe, for example? That would be a very easy switch. Might be a bit more expensive, possibly, but you've got to factor in the cost of the additional tariff. So where you might have not chosen Europe before, maybe it's better now. Similar to the UK, we have a free trade agreement with the UK. Look at options there. Also look at your sales. Can you start diversifying your sales into other markets? How long would that take? How easy is it? Talk to Enterprise Ireland on that. Look at your customs planning. If you are selling on to a sister company, if you're kind of a larger company, you're selling to a sister company, what is the pricing arrangement between you that complies with tax rules? Is there opportunity for example, in Europe, if you're importing products for manufacture and re-export, use what's called an inward processing duty suspension procedure, where you can import those goods without paying your customs duties as long as you ultimately re-export them outside Europe. So that if you're a company manufacturing here for export and maybe say 20% go on the EU market but 80% go to the US market, and you might not have thought about it before because it might not have been a saving, now it could be. So really engage with your customs advisors to look at the supply chain, look at what's coming in, what's going out, and identify where are the opportunities, where are the points that you can save money, where can you reduce the impact of these tariffs.
And Carol, finally, the tariffs, if they do come in as sort of mooted by the powers that be, has it been your experience that if tariffs come in, be it 200% on alcoholic drinks from the EU or 25%, whatever it may be, will companies filter that down to supply, like the raw materials, the suppliers, so for example, what our audience is wondering, will tillage farmers see less for a ton of grain? Will suppliers who feed into the Kerrygold brand, will they be seeing less for their litre of milk? Does that happen if large tariffs come in, that it filters down the supply chain?
At the end of the day, somebody has to take the hit. So it's either going to be the consumer or the manufacturer or the seller. So one of those three has to be hit. And it's probably, when you look at the kind of the company doing the sales and the manufacturing, it's up to them to look at both sides of the equation and see where can they work with the figures to maintain a profit level. So there is somebody gets hit. Somebody has to absorb those additional costs. Who is it going to be?
And then I suppose exactly who is it going to be? Are consumers in America, for example, Kerrygold is considered somewhat of a premium product over there anyway, and always has been. And the Irish community in particular have to pay a little more if they're US residents now to get their favourite butter, which is, my opinion, the best butter in the world, no matter what anyone says. But will they pay it? Will they pay it if Trump brings in these, tariffs? Will they? Because it is expensive, if you're already important to a product to a company, to another country that has a premium. So it'll be down to whether the consumers are willing to pay it as well. So that might guide policy after a certain amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A luxury product that you can only get from one supplier, you possibly will continue to pay. But if there's an alternative on the market that you can switch to, that's cheaper and maybe not quite as good, will you do that? So there's a difference, as I said kind of earlier as well, between those luxury specific products which you buy because you want that specific product, and other products where there are alternatives and you can kind of move your purchase.
Well, you mentioned even there on the sort of makeup and cosmetics end of things, you know, with like the Estee Lauder and the L'Oreal coming together, because clearly nowadays you hear the word dupe a lot, you know, and people will, I suppose, put their money where their mouth is. And if there's major expense added to those kind of cosmetics, you know, and people won't pay it, they'll get an alternative within the block, which there are many now. They'll probably do the same in terms of all other kind of products that face increased cost.
Yeah, because your cost of living is going to go up across the board. So you'll have less money in your pocket. How do you spend that money?
Absolutely. Well, that's all we have time for on this week's episode of AgriFocus. Thank you once again to our guest today, tax partner and head of Customs and International Trade Services with BDO Ireland, Carol Lynch. Please rate and review this podcast to ensure we can continue making informative podcasts for you, our audience. And please do share it with anyone you think might like to listen. Until next time, goodbye and take care.